Now here's the funny thing. As I was leaving the dining room that morning, he called to me. He said, Mac, you barely in the truth. He told me I was barely in the truth. I could barely make it to work that day. I was shattered. I was stumbling. I wanted someone to come study with me. He told me I was barely in the truth. But I caught on. I caught on. I began to realize that it's Jehovah's loving kindness. It's Jehovah's loving kindness. If you only knew how the brothers felt about you. If you only knew. Now, from time to time there at Bethel, they give us talks and discussion. It's designed to help us in our spirituality. And one talk, Brother Silic, he gave a talk. Let me tell you how he started. He said, I tell you now, we're going to talk about something you know very little about, if you will ever understand it. That's the way he started his talk. He says, you know very little bit about it, if you will ever understand it. He said, we're going to talk about Jehovah's loving kindness. He said, David is the new king. He said, there's a new king in Israel, and it's King David. This is the way he started his talk. He said, now usually whenever there was a new king, it'd be joyful times for the family of the new king, but horrible times for the family of the old king. So usually all of the boys in the family of the old king, they'd be killed, they'd be destroyed, they'd be wiped out for fear they would come back for revenge or reprisal. He said, but it's a new king in Israel. And David did something that was shocking. No other king had ever done this before. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 9. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, look at verse 1. This is what David said, and he's picturing Jehovah. And David proceeded to say, is there yet anyone that is left over of the house of Saul, that I may exercise loving kindness toward him for the sake of Jonathan? Saul was the old king. Now David does something that no one else had ever done. It's unprecedented. He said, is there anybody left that I can exercise loving kindness to him? He's looking for someone of that household to show loving kindness to. Well, look at the next verse. Now the house of Saul had a servant whose name was Ziba. That's significant. The house of Saul had a servant whose name was Ziba. So they called him to David. And the king then said to him, are you Ziba? To which he said, I am your servant. Now what Ziba is telling him, he says, I'm your man. I'm your servant. I've served in the house of Saul. I know what goes on in these households of royalty. I know what takes place here. I know who belongs here. He says, I'm your man. You're the new king, but I know how to run a household of a king. And so look at what David went on to say. Verse 3. And the king went on to say, is there nobody of the house of Saul anymore, that I may exercise toward him the loving kindness of God? You see, it's Jehovah's loving kindness. Now note the response. At this Ziba said to the king, there is yet a son of Jonathan, lame in the feet. Then the king said to him, where is he? So Ziba said to him, look, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodabar. Brother Sidlick said, Lodabar! Lodabar. He told us that was the ghetto. He said it was across the tracks. No one but cripples and undesirables lived in Lodabar. No one else wanted to live there. Ziba is saying, now hold on, king, don't go too far. He says, I know what belongs in this household of royalty. The only one who's left of Jonathan is his son. He's a cripple. He doesn't belong here. In fact, he lives in Lodabar. David said, that's the man that I'm looking for. You go and get him and you bring him to this house. That's who I'm looking for to show loving kindness to. It's the loving kindness of God. Mephibosheth was crippled because when the news came about his father and grandfather being killed, the nurse that was carrying him, she was running in a hurry, probably thinking for the fear of his life. She accidentally dropped him, and from there he was lame in both of his feet. And he's over there in Lodabar. And now the king is telling Ziba, you go and get him, because that's the man that I'm looking for. Now, what Brother Siddick did next, for those of us that had survived the talk up until now, what he did next, we fell out of our seat. He picked up a bell and he started ringing it. He said, dinner time in David's house. At dinner time in the king's house, who would you expect to be sitting at the king's table? Who dines at the table of a king? It would be David and all of his children. Now, beauty ran in David's family. Everybody remember that? It didn't do him much good, but beauty ran in the family. Oh, they were beautiful people. The Bible describes David as a ruddy man. That means you couldn't even put a finger on his complexion. He was just a beautiful man. And you remember David's son, his son, tall man, jet black hair, Absalom. Anybody remember Absalom? The sister said, mm-hmm. Absalom was so good looking that they cut his hair only once a year. When they cut his hair once a year, his hair alone weighed 5 pounds. You hear the sister? Yeah. His hair alone weighed 5 pounds. Now here's what the Bible says of Absalom. It said there was no man so beautiful as Absalom. From the crown of his head to the sole of his feet, there was no man in all Israel that proved to be so beautiful. What a man. And there's Absalom. He's sitting at the king's table because it's dinner time at David's house. And Absalom is sitting there. Well, who else would you expect to be there at the king's table? Who else would you expect to be there? You remember Absalom's sister Tamar? Oh, what a beautiful woman. Now, Brother Siddick, he described Tamar. We were looking for Tamar that night. Oh, we love our wives. Oh, we love our wives, but we were looking for Tamar that night. Now, he helped us to appreciate that the king's daughter, she would have access to beauty treatments to her that no other person would have. He said she probably smelled like the flowers of Lebanon, bathed with the oils of Bashan. Oh, we wanted to see Tamar. He just explained Tamar. She was so beautiful, remember, her half-brother raped her. She was so gorgeous, her own brother raped her. She was just that good looking. You see, it's dinner time at David's house, and beautiful Tamar would be sitting there. Well, who else would you expect to be at the king's table? He said there's Solomon probably sitting at the end of the table with his head buried in a book. There's studious Solomon right there. Remember David's 2 nephews? Abishai and then Joab. Mighty warriors. Courageous men. Now, by now, he's strutting to and from the platform. He's demonstrating Joab walking in. He said, and in walks Joab, sun-baked, skin like tan leather, beady eyes of a killer. He's just showing us how he's walking in. And he said, Joab walks in and he was cut. So in walks Joab. And he finds his seat at David's table along with his relative Abishai. And all of a sudden you hear scark, clink, scark, clink, scark, clink, scark, clink. In walks a cripple. With all of this beauty at the table, in walks a cripple. Brother Siddick said his kids probably said, Dad, can he take his food to go, please? And that's when he lowered the boom on us. Anyone that survived the talk up till now, or we heard a talk that night. Anyone who was at Bethel will never forget that talk. Because it demonstrated Jehovah's loving kindness. And that's when he told us. He said, we're all crippled brothers. Adam and Eve dropped every one of us. We're all crippled. We're all messed up. Just look at ourselves. We're all messed up. You know, and if you don't think you're messed up, that's what's wrong with you. You don't know you're messed up. You're just as messed up as all the rest of us. We're all crippled. We have frailties and infirmities. We don't want anyone to know.